So we're nearing the end of the tunnel, I promise, but I want to continue a little bit more with what we're doing right now, which is stuff that's a little bit more topical and in the news. So in light of the events of 2020, especially the Black Lives Matter riots and the COVID situation, so in what circumstances can the president declare a state of emergency? Should Trump have declared a state of emergency? What should he have done? And what would the state of emergency allow him to do?
Well, there is an act of Congress on this, actually, although there are a number of powers, which I suppose you could call emergency powers, already embedded in the Constitution. But there's the National Emergencies Act 1976, which was passed, strangely enough, during the presidency of Gerald Ford. It has got certain restrictions on it, and the president has to come to Congress and so on. It hasn't been used very much. But I think he really should have, and something I did advise him to do on the internet. I think he really should have. He was a little bit too, if you like, states' rights over that by throwing the ball into the court of the state's governors and then criticizing them, for which I don't think he got any thanks from the electorate.
No.
I do think that called for a national emergency. I don't see why that would have been resisted. I mean, it might have been resisted, but I don't think it would have been successfully resisted.
But that was the main complaint from the Democrats, was that he wasn't taking control of the situation. Am I
Well,
wrong?
yes, that was their complaint because he wasn't. If he had, their complaint would have been that he was too control.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, I mean, that's playing politics. You always got to play politics, obviously. But no, I think he was wrong not to do that. I think he was wrong.
And
Just
what
to allow cities to burn like that, one after the other. I mean, the country was in a state of chaos.
Yeah.
And especially when you got what he called the fake news onto it, they would only show you the worst possible scenes and then blame it on him. But he could have cracked down on those and he did say on occasion, this has got to end and this will end right now, but it didn't.
Okay, so we're specifically talking about the Black Lives Matter riots and protests right now.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, got it.
But any kind of riot, I mean, of course, then there's the other riot he supposedly sparked off in the Capitol in January by giving that speech, inflammatory speech, supposedly, and using the phrase, we will be going to the Capitol, something like that.
Yeah.
Gave the impression that he was going to be leading them to the Capitol, although not necessarily in a frenzy of attack. I don't know.
Yeah.
But
to his defense, he did say we're going to go there peacefully and let our voice be heard. But I think in hindsight, he really should have maybe thought twice. I don't think he knew who supports him. Actually, I shouldn't say that. It's a pretty bad blanket statement. But when I say that, I mean some of the more fringe people who do support him, which every political party, every candidate has their fringe people, not just Trump. But some of these people, they were really ready for a fight. And I don't think he gauged that well enough. He was too caught up in the moment, I would say.
Well, and I think they were particularly incensed by what they saw as a stolen election.
Yeah.
Whether there was any truth to that, I don't know. That's still coming up before the Supreme Court, although it makes no sense. It's moot because they're not going to reverse. They've already said they're not going to reverse the result of the election. But that will look if they come out with a conclusion that the election was actually, there was fraudulent, there were fraudulent votes. But I have a feeling they will make sure that even if they say that, they'll be sure to add that, but it would have made no difference to the result. There may have been some fraudulent votes, but not enough to change the result, because you would have needed a lot. And that's where I would say that's something I've written about. It's not in the book. How to solve that problem. People blame the Electoral College and say, oh, this Electoral College system is so antiquated, it's causing all these problems. Well, it isn't causing the problems. What's causing the problems is something else, which happens to be linked to the Electoral College, but is very different from the Electoral College, because the Electoral College is in the Constitution. You can't abolish the Electoral College without a constitutional amendment. But this other thing isn't in the Constitution, and that is winner take all. The winner take all rule, where in, like, California, you just need to beat the next highest candidate by one vote. In talking about presidential election, if you get one more vote than the next highest candidate, you take all 55 electoral votes. That's complete nonsense. And there's no need for that, and it's not in the Constitution. Why can't it be split proportionally, so that if you get 40% of the votes in a particular state, you should get 40% of the electoral vote for that state? That happens already in 2 states, in not quite as straightforward a manner as that. That is Maine and Nebraska. They're not quite as straightforward. It's a bit of a mixed system there, but those are very tiny states. So splitting the vote there isn't going to make any difference to the overall result normally. It has on occasion been split. This last time it was, but it didn't make any difference to the overall vote, overall result. Whereas if it were across the board, it would. I think it could make a very big difference. And I think then the popular vote and the electoral vote would not normally be different, because that's one of the things that rankles people. How can somebody is 3 million, or in this case perhaps even 7 million votes short, lower than the other person, win the election? In the case of the 2016 election, the candidate with 3 million less popular votes won the election. In 2020, the one with the most popular votes won the election, which may seem fairer, but assuming, of course, that those votes were cast fairly. But this would obviate the need for all this business about fraudulent voting, because the difference between winning by 10 votes and winning by 1 million votes would no longer, there wouldn't be the need to make sure that you win by just a few votes, but that's all you need now. You just need to be ahead by a few votes. In the end, in the 2000 election, Bush was declared by the US Supreme Court to have won, I think, by 537 votes in Florida. That's what carried the whole election. 537 votes in Florida. That's wrong. An election shouldn't hinge on such a minor thing as that.
And I know this is kind of a side note. This doesn't really pertain to the point you're trying to make. But as far as changing the winner-take-all system, it could have another effect, I think, where it actually could encourage more people to vote. And
Yeah.
because there's so many people like in solidly blue districts that don't even bother because they know
Yeah.
it's not going red. But
Yeah,
if,
they assume their
yeah,
state is either red or blue, and they don't bother. Yeah.
we could see a literal shift in the voting dynamic, demographics throughout the country based on that, I would imagine.
Oh, I think that's right, and I think that's another good point in favor of it.
Yeah.
Whether that could ever be agreed generally, I doubt, but
Hmm.
it won't require a constitutional amendment because it's not in the Constitution, nothing to do with the Constitution.
Got it.
It's up to the individual states. That's how Nebraska and Maine managed to do it, and they could change back.
Yeah.
And there are other schemes which are not as good, but that scheme, it's a very simple scheme. Split the electoral vote in accordance, in proportion to the popular vote in each state.
Can you think of any reason, because there's always some angle, can you think of any reason why they don't currently do that? Or is it just an accident of history?
Well, I think because it's not politically in their favor. I mean, for example, I don't think the Democrats would like to share the vote in California or New York,
Sure.
which will normally go blue, but may have a sizable red contingent.
Sure.
So just because you're sure you're going to win California and get all 55 votes there, if it changed to what I'm suggesting, you might lose 20 of those votes, 30 of those votes. You still win it, but not in the way that they have been used to.
And the truth may be the same on the other side. There may be some red
Exactly.
states that don't want to lose those votes either.
Yeah,
So yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
That's right.
no, makes sense. Makes sense. So I want to continue with one more thing that's recent, topical in the news, and it's connected to the election and all that. And also connected to what you were saying about the January 6th insurrection, quote unquote. So in light of what happened recently with Trump and the impeachment, there's no way I could end this interview without asking you about it. So is it constitutional? Is it constitutionally correct for an ex-president to be impeached?
Yeah, well, I don't think so, really, on the basis of, again, the wording of the Constitution, because the only thing that impeachment seems to be for is removal from office. If you're not in office anymore, then it should no longer be applicable to you. However, there has been one case which seems to contradict that. That's the case of Belknap, William Belknap, who was Secretary of War under President Grant, and he was involved in quite a lot of corruption. And in 1879, Congress was moving to impeach him, and he quickly ran over to the White House, burst into tears, and resigned. And they then went ahead, nevertheless, with the impeachment, which they had already begun. And that's why he resigned. And they said, well, he's only resigned to avoid impeachment. We can't let him get away with it. And it went to trial before the Senate. And I think they took at least 2 weeks to discuss this question of whether he could, in fact, be impeached, having resigned. And he was acquitted because they weren't able to get the 2/3 majority. And of the 25 votes that he got in the Senate, which because the Senate was a lot smaller back then. 23 of those made it clear that the reason they voted in favor of him was not because they didn't think he was guilty of the offenses that were charged, high crimes and misdemeanors, not anything to do with that, but simply because they didn't think it was right to try him as an ex-secretary, ex-cabinet secretary. They made it clear. 23 of the 25 who came out in his favor made that clear, that was the reason. That was the only reason.
And do you believe that that was correct?
I think probably, because in his case it was also immediate, I frankly think that impeachment is not intended except for removal from office. And they were talking this time around in the second impeachment of Trump about, yes, but what about banning from future office?
Yeah, which is what they're really doing.
And there. He can be removed from office and banned from holding any future office under the United States. But I think that and shows you how these words, the and can make such a difference.
I was just thinking the same thing.
I think the word and there means that's riding on top of the removal from office. I don't think it's separate. It's not or. It's not or. It's and.
Got it.
So I think you have to be removed. It's only for removal from office. Yes, and other things can ride on top of that, but not separate. Permanent banning is not an or. So I think that's wrong. I think someone or lost the election, who's no longer in office for one reason or another, should not be able to be impeached. There are the ordinary law courts for that. You know, the crimes that impeachment is supposed to cover are what are called high crimes and misdemeanors. And of course, that's been endlessly debated as well, what is meant by that. But that aside, something like inciting an insurrection, which is more or less what he was accused of, could certainly be brought in the ordinary law courts. And I have a feeling will be now. I think.
Really?
Oh yes, I'm quite sure he will be. He will be indicted on that in the ordinary law courts, which is where it should have gone in the first place. I don't think it has anything to do with impeachment at all, because it's a judicial function. It's a judicial. Trying someone for high crimes and misdemeanors normally would go to the judiciary. It only goes to the Congress because it's to do with office holders.
I think their main motivation of trying this, whether it was right or wrong, was, like you said, to just prevent him from running again.
Well, of course, but they should have realized they didn't have the votes because they needed 2/3.
Yeah, mathematically speaking, it was a given that it wasn't going to work.
Yeah,
so.
I mean, there were 7. I thought originally 6, but then there were 7 Republicans who defected to the Democrat side. But they should have realized that there weren't going to be many more than that. It was never going to be a majority.
Yeah.
Never going to give them a 2/3 majority. They should have realized that. They could have done the math and realized that from the beginning. But somehow either they didn't or they did, and they didn't care. But and of course it rankles, gives a bad taste in the mouth. Here's the only president who's been impeached twice. And of course, unfortunately, people don't understand the word impeach doesn't mean found guilty of anything. Impeach just means that you've been accused.
Yeah.
You've been accused and brought to trial on this. But it doesn't have the meaning of actually being found guilty. That's separate. So that, for example, all the presidents, in fact, who've been impeached have been found not guilty. Not one of them has ever been found guilty.
Yeah.
But there have been now 3 presidents impeached.
Oh.
didn't do Clinton any harm.
No.
And Trump, I don't know. So they can't block him from running for office, except he'd be 80 years old. So, frankly, I don't think he's really in the running.
I don't think he's going to run. But I would imagine his family is, though. But we shall see.
And I think he's going to be a major contender on the internet and on the television.
Yeah.
He had a very successful show on television for years, The Apprentice show. Now he can have a sort of lambasting of the Democratic administration.
He also still has an unbelievably huge, or should I say huge in Trump speak, following. He has a huge following, so he can also be a kingmaker. You know, just by his endorsement, he could get people voted into office.
Well, and he's already done that, and he's already blocked some Republicans from being re-elected or from running again.
Yeah.
Yes, and that probably will continue.
So we could go on all day, but I definitely want to bring this eventually to an end, for your sake more than mine, because trust me, I could do this all day. But I know, every good thing needs to come to an end. There is one last thing, though, and we'll make this as quick as we can. Okay, so I posted on Facebook that I was going to be interviewing you, and I had several people post questions. Now, just for the sake that they were nice enough to post the questions, I just wanted to run it past you real quick, and then we can wrap it up. So the first question was submitted by a guy I know named Eric. Now, I can't really sum up these people in like a word or two, but just because I feel like doing it, because it's more fun, I'm going to. So we're gonna call Eric the Angry Republican, okay? And his question is,
not Eric Trump, then?
Eric who?
Eric Trump?
No, not Eric Trump. No, my friends aren't that high level yet. We'll see. So his question is, why is it that the Second Amendment seems to be unique in the fact that there are so many laws regulating and restricting gun ownership, as opposed to slavery or women's suffrage, which have no exceptions?
Well, I think there's a bit of a difference there. And although I agree that there should be a right of gun ownership, I also think with Scalia that there's got to be a limit. Should you be allowed to carry a cannon around with you? With voting rights, you either have the right or you don't have the right. But with gun rights, it's not as simple as that, because it depends in what circumstances should it be hidden or open, and what type of firearm should you be allowed. So I think it's not a parallel. It's not a parallel. And I think it is fair that there should be some restrictions.
I think that was a great answer. I don't think Eric is going to like your answer, but I'll back you up. Okay. So now the next question was submitted by Hector, and we're going to call Hector an angry libertarian. Okay. So was the Constitution intended to rein in the growth of the state? If so, does it have any self-correcting processes that automatically kicks in to assure this, or does it not have any such mechanism? And so are we left to conclude that the Constitution is structurally designed to encourage the growth of state? And again, remember, I said angry libertarian.
To encourage the growth of the state, or to encourage the growth of the Fed?
The growth of, well, when he says state, I believe he's not talking about states like states' rights, like New Jersey, Massachusetts. He's using that word to mean basically government.
The government of the federal government.
Yeah.
Well, certainly the original Constitution, the Confederation, was very loose and gave total power really to the states, and there was no executive. So that had to be brought in. So to that extent, by having an executive straight away and a more unified government, albeit federal rather than just a unitary state. It's federal, but it did reign in the states to some extent, and after the Civil War, much more so, and that was deliberate. That was deliberate, and also the rise of the imperial presidency has had that effect since FDR, Truman even, and certainly later Kennedy, Nixon, Johnson. The president, Reagan even, the power of the presidency has grown. And of course, as the power of the country has grown, so the power of the executive has grown. So, I mean, the leaders of China and Russia couldn't understand how the president, Richard Nixon, could have been treated in the way he was and forced out. That could never happen in their country. Well, yes, I mean, it could in a way. They've had, assassinations and whatnot, and all sorts of shenanigans. But once someone is ensconced in power, they're there for good, like Putin in Russia now and Xi in China. These people are practically irremovable. They can't understand it. And the same applied then, Mao and the Russian leaders. To them, Nixon was a great statesman. He was in many ways. And how he could have been treated so shabbily by his own country, they couldn't understand. They still honored him the same way as they had when he was president. And so the fact of America's being a great power, which really only happened, you can say, after World War I, has enhanced the power of the president, particularly. Woodrow Wilson didn't quite manage that, because although he had a big liberal plan for the rest of the world, he wasn't a big liberal at home. In fact, he segregated Washington and was insistent on segregating the army, and even gave a speech telling black people in Washington, D.C., how good it was for them. Segregation was good for the blacks.
Well, I would argue that back then, progressivism and racism and even eugenics was very intermingled.
Oh, yeah, yeah. But he was a great statesman on the world stage, although he wasn't able to persuade America to join the League of Nations ever. It was his invention, but America never joined. But then, with the Second World War, World War II, again, FDR said he wasn't going to go to war, just as Wilson had done. He had to in the end because of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Some say he knew about it in advance, he wanted that, and so on, I don't know. But the point is, that is what really put America on the map. But when America is on the map, that means the president is on the map. It greatly enhances the executive. Yes, they're supposed to be controlled by Congress over war, declarations of war, which have never been made since World War II, are supposed to be under the control of Congress.
Which is something that I desperately want to talk about, but we're not going to have time today to get too deep into that. But finish your thought.
Foreign policy is the one main area where the power of the presidency has greatly increased because of the power of the country, and also partly because of policies sometimes rather recklessly pursued by the president, like, I mean, the Vietnam War, which was a complete mistake from the beginning, I believe.
Oh my goodness, don't get me started.
And Lyndon Johnson had no clue about foreign policy at all. He didn't have a clue. Nixon was then plunged into it. He was much better on foreign policy, but he also resorted to expanding the war. But I rather feel that was because he felt he was pushed into it. I don't believe he really wanted that. Whether there would ever have been a Vietnam War had Nixon won in 1960 instead of Kennedy is something I've often pondered. And I really wonder, because Nixon was not a warmonger, and Republican presidents generally haven't been, which is the interesting thing. Reagan made peace with the Soviet Union, and Trump, of the most recent presidents, he's one who did not declare any new wars.
Yep.
I mean, George Bush, those 2 wars that he opened up, completely disastrous.
Yes.
And totally unnecessary. Totally unnecessary.
And we're still there.
Still there, absolutely. So, but that's really what's made the president more powerful than Congress. Although it was in the 1870s, a political science student or graduate wrote a book called Congressional Government, in which he said that the way he portrayed American government was Congress controlling it. And who was that student? Woodrow Wilson, who became a very strong president, except when his wife was the president, of course. It was towards the end of his life when he had a stroke. She actually ran the country and pretended it was him. But doesn't mean it wasn't a strong president. It just means it wasn't him. It was his wife. And I think that's all come out lately. But at the time, I don't even think his cabinet realized. They used to wheel him in very carefully so that he looked as though he was in charge. And then they made sure the cabinet meetings didn't last, but they were very, very few meetings. And a few senators visited him when he was in his sick bed, and he put up a good performance, and they thought he was compos mentis. He may have been, but physically he was a wreck. And actually he outlived his successor, but he was in no fit state. Anyhow, that's a totally different topic. But the strength of the presidency is the main thing that I think I have to emphasize there to your friend Hector.
Okay. Next question submitted by Rob, another angry libertarian.
Oh, yeah.
Why would anyone have any respect for a document that was the result of a power-grabbing betrayal by the statists? Again, when he says statists, he means people that are obsessed with government control and federal government control. By the statists trying to centralize power for their cronies. To be honest with you, I'm not even sure exactly what he means by that, but yeah, that was his question.
I don't think that was actually what happened, because there was a constitutional convention, and a number of the people there were very much not statists in the sense that he's talking about, but state-minded in the sense of individual states, states' rights, like Thomas Jefferson, although people think that he, maybe he was instrumental in making the central government stronger. George Washington. There was a big debate about exactly, for example, how you should even address the president. Should he be Your Excellency? They were thinking of on the lines of foreign heads of state. But in the end, what won out was a very simple Mr. President. Mr. President. And I think it is very, very carefully balanced between the executive and the legislature, and also to some extent still between the federal and state governments. State governments still had and still do have quite a lot of power, but as time has gone by, that power, the power of the individual states, has definitely diminished. There's no doubt. But compared to the earlier constitution, the pre-federal, the confederation, yes, it was more centralized, but that was necessary to make one country out of it, because that previous constitution was actually chaotic. It wasn't a country, and it wasn't working well. and this was recognized by people like Washington. I don't think Washington was a great power grabber. Everyone knew that he had to be the first president, but he was taller than anybody else to begin with. And he'd won the war for them, after all. He was a regular British Army officer prior to that, but he became imbued with this idea. He was part of the elite. As I said, he was the richest man in America. They were all part of the elite, and they wanted their own country.
Maybe that's what my friend is getting at. Now that you're saying this, maybe what he meant by cronies was the fact that they were the elite of the time.
No, they were the elite. They wanted independence from Britain because Britain wasn't prepared to listen to them.
Mm-hmm.
Had Britain thought of the idea of dominion status, which came later with Canada, or representative government, or what's later called responsible government, which is more independent, I think America could have remained part of the British Commonwealth. And like Canada, they only thought of that later, and it came to pass in 1867 that Canada was given a good deal of independence from Britain. And later came Dominion status, that came much later, 1936, 1931, with the so-called Westminster, Statute of Westminster, where countries like Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and of course Canada, and later India, became dominions, which meant they were virtually independent, but under the crown. So the crown was just a nominal thing. The Queen to this day is the Queen of Canada. She's the Queen of Australia. She doesn't have any power there anymore. She has probably a little more power in Australia, as it turned out a few years back, than she had in Britain. She has no real power in Britain. But it was a unifying sort of factor, and they had their own independence. And America could have been like that, would have been similar in a way to what eventually happened, only it wouldn't have been a complete break from Britain. And in 1812, Britain wouldn't have burned down the White House.
Okay.
And caused President Madison to scuttle away.
Dr. Arnheim, believe it or not, we have come to the final question. Okay. So this is submitted by Skip. Now, I really don't know how to describe Skip other than he's one of the most interesting people I've ever met. So his question is very simply, why didn't it work?
Why didn't what work?
The Constitution. Now, I did not ask for negative questions. This just kind of happened naturally, but this was their questions, and that was Skip's question.
I think it has worked, actually.
Okay. Okay.
But of course, it's had its ups and downs. It's worked in the sense that, whether because or in spite of it, or got nothing to do with it, America has become a great power, or at the moment probably the only great power in the world, probably not for long. But whether that's anything to do with the Constitution, I don't know. But I think the Civil War certainly was something that could have been avoided and should have been. I don't quite know why Abraham Lincoln is given such a tremendous amount of credit. Even Trump was always invoking the name of Abraham Lincoln, who frankly I think is one of the worst presidents ever. That war could certainly have been averted. Both his predecessor and his successor, who are both regarded as failures as presidents, I believe were better than him. Buchanan, whose name is now practically forgotten, James Buchanan, who at the last minute, literally on the last day of his term, came up with a constitutional amendment which was a compromise on slavery, which even Lincoln accepted in his inaugural address, his first inaugural. He took it for granted that would be passed. It wasn't, because the southern states didn't trust Lincoln and they seceded.
Mm-hmm.
But Buchanan came up with that right at the end. Normally, a president isn't involved with constitutional amendment, but he signed it. The first time a constitutional amendment was ever signed by a president, then Lincoln signed his one. But presidents aren't normally involved in that. And Buchanan left it far too late, obviously. And as for his successor, Andrew Johnson, I think he was the wrong Johnson to have been impeached. I think Lyndon Johnson should have been the one to be impeached, not Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was impeached because he was the wrong party. The reason he was vice president was because he was a Southern Democrat, and because Lincoln was afraid of losing the election. And so he got Johnson in on the ticket, never, of course, expecting to be assassinated, stupidly, sitting there in an open box in the theater right on the border of the South. What an idiot. And Johnson tried to mitigate the what came to be called Reconstruction. Not Reconstruction at all, it was suppression. I think both of those presidents were better than Lincoln, who was basically a warmonger, in my opinion. And the vice president of the Confederacy, whom he knew from Congress, they were both Whigs in Congress together long before the war, tried to approach him many times to talk peace. He wouldn't even see him, wouldn't agree to meet.
Wow.
So that was a very bad mistake and a very bad break in the Constitution, I believe. But the country picked itself up and went from strength to strength, particularly after, well, I suppose you can say in the late 19th century and then in the 20th century, and of course being basically the power broker in the world in both the First World War and World War II has meant that America has been very successful. So I wouldn't say the Constitution has been a failure in that respect. What better Constitution could there have been is another question. I don't know. I think, as I said at the beginning, one of the things I would have done is to split the position of head of state and head of government. I think that would probably be sensible, but that's a minor thing. And it has worked very well in Europe and in Asia and many other countries throughout the republics as well as monarchies, where the head of state is above politics and doesn't have any power, but has a certain respect, so that if you dislike the government, you don't attack the head of state, you only attack the head of government. But that's a minor point. Okay, so we're wrapping it up.
Yes, definitely. Well, I can't thank you enough for your time today and for hanging in there for almost 3 hours now. So I would love to have you back on at some point in the future if you're game for that, because I'd love to go over the Commerce Clause, the War Powers Act, state nullification, jury nullification, and more of the amendments. But unfortunately, we can't do that today. I want to thank you so much again. And I want to strongly encourage everyone to go buy this book, The U.S. Constitution for Dummies. Give me just a second. Let me make sure that this is, there you go. U.S. Constitution for Dummies. Not only do I recommend people buy it and read it, I recommend people read it every year so that they can keep these ideas fresh in their mind. Yeah, definitely. So go do that. And thank you again, Dr. Arnheim. Before I let you go, though, please let the audience know where they can find you and follow you.
Oh, yes, that's a good point. I think the easiest thing, actually, I mean, I do have a website, but I never use that. The easiest thing is an email address. My sort of folksy email address is drmike01, all spelled out, D-O-C-T. There's no way you can show it on the screen. Well, perhaps you can in the final. Dr. Mike 01, D-O, all spelled out, D-O-C-T-O-R-M-I-K-E 01 at gmail.com.
Perfect. So reach out to Dr. Michael Arnheim if you have any questions or if you need to contact him for anything. I'm assuming you're not a big social media guy, which is good because I spend way too much time on social media. So thank you again, Dr. Michael Arnheim. Let's do it again soon, okay?
Thank you, John.
All right, take care.
Thank you, everyone, if you're still awake after all this.